Welcome back to Bad Things in History, where we fight for our right to tell you about the mistakes of the past, so you can recognize them when you make them again. If you live in the United States today, then you might enjoy the right of free speech. If you don't incite violence, then you can say almost anything you want. That includes criticizing the government and those in charge of it. From 1918 to 1921, that right did not exist. Today we are going to tell you the story of how over 1,000 people went to prison for speaking against the United States government. The Great War. Woodrow Wilson began his first term as President of the United States in 1913. Many of his acts during the first year of his administration involved interference in Latin American countries. Nicaragua was occupied by the U.S. troops stationed there. The military occupied the Dominican Republic as well. And they were also sent to intervene in Cuba, Haiti, Honduras, and Panama. Early in 1914, members of the U.S. Navy accidentally landed in the port town of Tampico, Mexico. They were arrested for this transgression. On April 9, 1914, Wilson responded by sending the U.S. Navy to occupy the city of Veracruz. The invasion in Mexico caused a political backlash. Woodrow Wilson was forced to abandon his military plans for the region, but his appetite for war would not go unfulfilled for long. In July of 1914, conflict broke out across Europe. World War I had started. For the moment, the United States was neutral, but American merchants continued to trade with European nations on both sides of the conflict. For a time at least, European conflict was good for American businesses. A German submarine destroyed the RMS Lusitania on May 7, 1915. The disaster killed 1,198 passengers, including 128 Americans. Public opinion in the United States began to favor war with Germany, but neutrality remained the preferred policy. Wilson ran for re-election in 1916. The campaign slogan he used was, "He kept us out of war." Wilson also claimed that if the Republicans won, it would mean war with Germany. Woodrow Wilson was successful in winning a second term, but he would not keep his promises to avoid conflict. On January 17, 1917, Arthur Zimmerman sent a coded telegram to the German embassy in Mexico. Zimmerman was the Secretary of Foreign Affairs for Germany, and he had a proposal for Mexico. The first part of the telegram said, "We intend to begin on the 1st of February unrestricted submarine warfare. We shall endeavor, in spite of this, to keep the United States of America neutral. In the event of this not succeeding, we make Mexico a proposal of alliance on the following basis: make war together, make peace together, generous financial support, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona." British intelligence decoded the message and passed it to U.S. Ambassador Walter Hines Page. From there, it found its way to Woodrow Wilson and eventually the American public. There was now more public support for war than ever before. On April 6, 1917, Congress declared war against Germany. Resistance. Despite the public outrage concerning recent events, a lot of people in the United States did not want to go to war with Germany. And for many of those who did support it, they would be required to sacrifice their wealth to the government. At least 117,000 would give their lives. Waging war required soldiers. So Congress passed the Selective Service Act of 1917. It required men of eligible age to register for military service. Before the war was over, at least 3 million would be forced to serve. War also required money. The government decided to raise taxes to help fund the military. The top tax was raised to 77%. Businesses and individuals who earned beyond a certain amount were also required to pay an excess profit tax. A lot of those being taxed and drafted into military service were immigrants from other European countries. Some of them were being asked to fight against their home countries. Others just had a general desire to avoid war. Many of the dissatisfied immigrant voices were politically active. A lot of them were socialists and anarchists. They began speaking out against the war and protesting. Other political opponents of the Wilson administration began speaking against his actions. Feminists also joined them in claiming that going to war in Europe was a bad idea. Woodrow Wilson considered these people to be a threat to the United States military. Their actions, in his opinion, had the potential to overthrow the government. He asked Congress to act, and eventually they did. The Espionage Act of 1917. On December 7, 1915, Woodrow Wilson gave his State of the Union speech. He blamed dissent against the government on immigrants. His plea to Congress said, "There are citizens of the United States, I blush to admit, born under other flags but welcomed under our generous naturalization laws to the full freedom and opportunity of America, who have poured the poison of disloyalty into the very arteries of our national life, who have sought to bring the authority and good name of our government into contempt, to destroy our industries wherever they thought it effective for their vindictive purposes to strike at them, and to debase our politics to the uses of foreign intrigue. I urge you to enact such laws at the earliest possible moment and feel that in doing so I am urging you to do nothing less than save the honor and self-respect of the nation. Such creatures of passion, disloyalty, and anarchy must be crushed out." Congress spent months debating how far the bill should go in restricting the rights of angry citizens. To pass the legislation, they had to remove 2 provisions. In the original bill, the federal government would have the power to censor the press, and the president would have unlimited power to enforce this provision. This would not be allowed in the version that was signed into law, but the restrictions would still have a chilling effect on the freedoms of people in the United States. On June 15, 1917, the Espionage Act of 1917 became law. The new bill made it a crime to spread information that interfered with military operations. Using speech to help enemies of the United States could be punished with death or a 30-year prison sentence. The post office could also refuse to deliver materials that it thought violated the act. However, for Woodrow Wilson and the rest of those in charge of the war effort, the Espionage Act did not have enough restrictions. On May 16, 1918, several provisions were added to the bill. They are sometimes referred to as the Sedition Act of 1918. It prohibited speech such as any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, or the flag of the United States, or the uniform of the Army or Navy. The government now had all the tools it needed to suppress speech that it didn't want. Prosecution and Imprisonment. As soon as the law was passed, prosecutors all over the country began putting citizens in jail. Eugene Victor Debs was a socialist and political activist. He ran for president under the Socialist Party of America 5 times. Before that, he was involved with several labor movements. Eugene was also a devoted opponent of Woodrow Wilson's policies. He opposed the war and said so publicly and often. Wilson replied with accusations that Eugene was a traitor to his country. On June 16, 1918, Eugene gave a speech in Canton, Ohio. He urged people to resist being drafted into the military. 2 weeks later, he was arrested and charged with 10 counts of sedition. During his trial, no witnesses were called. Eugene Debs asked to speak in his own defense, and the request was granted. Part of his 2-hour-long speech said, "Your Honor, I have stated in this court that I am opposed to the form of our present government, that I am opposed to the social system in which we live, that I believe in the change of both, but by perfectly peaceable and orderly means. Your Honor, I ask no mercy, I plead for no immunity. I realize that finally the right must prevail. I never more fully comprehended than now the great struggle between the powers of greed on the one hand and upon the other the rising hosts of freedom. I can see the dawn of a better day of humanity. The people are awakening. In due course of time they will come into their own." On September 18, 1918, Eugene was sentenced to 10 years in prison. His sentence was commuted in 1921 by President Warren G. Harding. Speech restrictions went beyond criticism of the United States government. Saying unpleasant things about allies could also be punished with prison. In 1917, a silent film was made called The Spirit of 76. It was about the Revolutionary War and did not depict the British in a favorable manner. The producer and writer of this film, Robert Goldstein, was sentenced to a 10-year prison term. He broke the law by making the British look bad. Robert's sentence was commuted 3 years later. Religious groups who did not support the war effort were also targeted for prosecution. The Watchtower Bible and Tract Society is an organization created and managed by Jehovah's Witnesses. It is used to spread the doctrines of their religious beliefs, one of which is opposition to war. Their form of pacifism was offensive to government officials. A book they published in 1917 stated, "Nowhere in the New Testament is patriotism, a narrowly minded hatred of other peoples, encouraged. Everywhere and always murder in its every form is forbidden. And yet, under the guise of patriotism, civil governments of the earth demand of peace-loving men the sacrifice of themselves and their loved ones, and the butchery of their fellows, and hail it as a duty demanded by the laws of heaven." In May 1918, the president of the society and 7 of its officers were charged with violating the Espionage Act. They were accused of insubordination, disloyalty, and refusing to serve the U.S. military during a time of war. The 8 men were sentenced to 20 years. They were released after serving 9 months. Ultimately, more than 1,000 United States citizens would be imprisoned for speaking against the government. Repealed. Many of those who were convicted of violating the Espionage Act appealed their cases all the way to the Supreme Court. In almost every case, the justices were on the side of the government. Their positions were clear. Congress passed a law that you could not speak against the government. If you break the law, you should go to jail. Most of the justices on the court didn't see any conflict between this law and the First Amendment. The war officially ended on November 11, 1918, but restrictive laws against speech in the United States remained in effect. Over the next 2 years, public opposition to government overreach began to rise. Woodrow Wilson started offering clemency to many of those who had been imprisoned. On March 3, 1921, Congress repealed the Sedition Act provisions. Citizens could no longer be imprisoned for politically opposing the government. The Supreme Court also reversed many of its earlier decisions in favor of restrictions on speech. The Espionage Act of 1917 is still in effect. It is mostly used today for prosecuting spies that sell secrets to foreign governments. During World War I, every branch of the government agreed that letting citizens speak against it was a criminal act. Do you think it could happen again? If not, what do you think can stop it? If you find this period of history interesting, you might also like a series we have called Bad Things Happened in the 1920s. If you want to know how horrible the early 20th century really was, then it may be your thing. We never know when our right to speak will be restricted, and, according to recent Supreme Court decisions, money is speech. So, if you want to keep history coming every week, think about giving us some of your speech. We have a Patreon page for that. The link is in the video description below. Thank you for watching Bad Things in History.